Hello. Okay, so it's a pleasure to kick off our very first Kempner Seminar of this semester and introduce Professor Kyunghyun Cho, who really needs no introduction and no leading figure in machine learning, and his work spans from foundations, theories to large-scale systems with real impact. Professor Cho is the Glenn D. Rice Professor of Health Statistics at NYU, with appointments in both computer science and Center for Data Science. He's also co-director of the Global Frontier AI Lab. Also beyond academia, he co-founded Efficient Design, which was later acquired by Genentech. Kyunghyun has also played a lot of leadership roles in the machine learning community, serving program chairs of IQ, Nuix, and CML, and others. And was also founding editor-in-chief of Transactions on Machine Learning Research. On a personal note, I just moved from NYU to Harvard, and Kyunghyun was an amazing colleague and friend while I was there. I'm super happy to be here, but I do miss seeing him around. It's really an amazing combination of both being deeply intellectually engaging, but also fun and relaxed. So I should also add that clearly far too popular because coordinating his schedule today was a bit of a challenge for the folks. So with that, Kyunghyun, the stage is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the very generous introduction. Just told me that I'm a good friend, and then somehow she had to move here from NYU. I wonder what that means. But well, just one quick thing I want to tell you is that yes, I founded the Prescient Design, and we've been part of the Genentech for now 4 years or so. Today, this is actually my last day at Genentech. So from tomorrow, I'll be just at NYU. And today's talk is going to be kind of the same talk that I gave at Europe a month ago as one of the keynote talks. And then back then, it was a really large audience. I had to just go through the entire thing within 45 minutes or so. But today, we have a smaller group, and I want it to be more interactive. So if you have any thoughts that you want to share as I talk, just feel free to raise your hand, and then we can actually talk about it. So just to tell you about my background a bit, despite the fact that I'm a Glenn degree professor of health statistics, I have no background in health or the healthcare nor statistics. I was actually a computer science major from the very beginning to the end, the undergrad, master's, and doctoral studies as well. And then I did my postdoc with Joshua Vengio, and then that was actually the information research department back then in Europe. And then throughout this entire period, we've been busy, right? So you take courses, you study a bit, you work a bit, and then you hang out with your friends. Then you naturally, or at least I was naturally, kind of to say, led to believe that I'm a computer scientist, although I never actually thought about what computer science is. In fact, by the end of my doctoral degree, I was really like I'm a computer scientist. This mindset has been ingrained so much to the point that I wrote this arrogant title for my dissertation, like Foundations and Advances in Deep Learning. Unfortunately, in this dissertation, there were no foundation, no advances in deep learning. But well, a bit of arrogance by the end of your PhD program, I think, is necessary skill to acquire. So then, I want to start by asking the question who we are, right? Because we all are sitting here all together. That probably means that we all belong to some discipline, right? A discipline. And then, we are often told, and I heard that there's a diverse set of, let's say, backgrounds in terms of what kind of training people went through in this room. Sometimes we're told that we're in computer science, sometimes data science, applied mathematics, applied statistics, machine learning, artificial intelligence, neuroscience, theoretical neuroscience, on and on and on. But then who are we? Like, what are we actually studying? Many of these names are extremely vague and they're so broad to the point that it's really difficult to pick any one of them and then say that, that's what I do or that that's what any one of you does. So after finishing my PhD degree, and I couldn't really tell what I was who I was, thereby I couldn't really tell what I wanted to do. So I decided to continue my training as a postdoc at Mila, which used to be called the Lisa back then. That is the lab that was created by Yoshua Bengio, and there was a collective of many of the research scientists and the professors in University of Montreal, as well as McGill. And then, I went there. I sat down. It was a kind of open office space without any windows. You just sit wherever the open chair was. And I sat down. Then Joshua came to me and then asked me what I wanted to work on. I asked Joshua, well, you tell me what I should work on, and then I'll just work on that one. And Joshua was like, oh, why don't you continue to work on both machines that I was actually working on back then? Or it was like the better option is to work on this better version of the Boltzmann machines called the stochastic generative networks or the generative stochastic networks. If you don't know what that is, it's okay because unfortunately it didn't really was picked up by the community. It was supposed to be a better version of Boltzmann machines. And then he told me that third option is the so-called machine translation. But I never worked on machine translation before. I never even worked on the natural language processing, nor even taken any of the courses by then. And I also knew that Joshua didn't really have experience working on machine translation, so I asked Joshua back. But Joshua, I don't know anything about machine translation, nor do you. Is it a good idea to go for it? And then he told me that he thought that this is the right time to work on machine translation, and he tried to build it ground up. I was like, sounds fun. Let's do that. And that's how I started to work on machine translation. But then, of course, it is a puzzling choice. Often when you go for a postdoc, often what people do is to try to ensure that you dig deeper into what you're doing. Thereby, you're going to kind of guarantee or improve the chance of becoming an academician or getting a better job afterward. Because how long do we do a postdoc? In computer science, 1 to 2 years. In neuroscience, probably longer. In biology, until you retire. So it varies, but often just a temporary thing. You don't want to be a postdoc too long. But then I thought, this is really interesting. We should work, I don't know, maybe it's a good idea to work on machine translation. Then I started to reading some of the textbooks as well as some papers about machine translation back then, which looked very different from the machine translation research as well as the systems now. And I realized that in fact, there were some of the things that I learned to use during my grad studies that might be useful for tackling this problem. So what were those? Once you abstract out all those details about machine translation, because often when we think about translation, the first thing our mind goes to is language. It's about translating a text written in one language to a text written in another language. So then we probably need to think about the natural language or the human language very carefully. And then when we think about human language, what we first do is to think about language starts with words. And then we're going to combine those words into phrases. And then we're going to combine those phrases into sentences. And then on and on and on. But let's just abstract away all those things. Let's forget about these phrases. Let's forget about these parse trees. Let's forget about all those different things that you can imagine. And then, if you think about the text as just a sequence of the discrete tokens, then what you end up with is nothing but a conditional density estimation via nonlinear function estimation. That is simply put supervised learning. This is a slide that I use during one of my very first talks at Lisa or Mila in 2013 when I got there. There used to be something called the Tea Talk series. So every week we would sit down together drinking tea or coffee, and then one of us would present their ongoing work or somebody else's work. And then this was the idea I had, is that machine translation seems to be very straightforward. All we need is that we need to have an encoder that's going to extract some variable, z, from the source sentence of length k, and then we're going to just generate out the sentence using a decoder. And then in fact, this was the key thing. And then what I did for my PhD was all about doing a density estimation with a neural network, back then using Boltzmann machines, which I never got to use after I graduated. And then that's what we referred to back then as an encoder-decoder approach. And then there is that the function approximation-based approach to machine translation. Then we started to call it neural machine translation, and we pushed it very much. And then this kind of replaced the whole, paradigm of how we build machine translation. Just in case you're interested in what kind of things we could do by changing this mindset or the paradigm, go check out my talk from EMLP 2019. And then there I talk about how the attention came by, multilingual translation, how the multilingual translation was enabled, how we could even do the unsupervised translation, where we didn't really need the paired examples to build the machine translation system, and then all the way to non-monotonic or the any order generation for the sequences, and also the iterative denoising. Of course, I shouldn't really call it iterative denoising. I need to call it a diffusion-based sequence model in order to make it much more fancy, right? But anyway, diffusion-based models, everything was kind of there back then. So, but the unfortunate thing is that it was very clear already in 2017 or so that I wasn't actually working on machine translation. It was a very generic and general solution for processing any kind of sequence. And then already some of those techniques that we were developing were tied to speech processing, dialogue modeling, and then very soon afterward, handling the language of biology and others. That is, that it went even beyond the natural of the human language. And that was a bit unfortunate because 2016 or 17, I thought I was becoming or already had become a researcher in computational linguistics or natural language processing. But apparently I wasn't, because everything I did had absolutely nothing to do with the human language and could be used for anything else as long as those were seen. So I was kind of, let's say, right back where I started. And I should have actually known about this 3 years earlier because in 2014 at New Reefs in Montreal, Ilya Sutskever, presenting about his work on the sequence-to-sequence learning, actually concluded his talk by saying that these methods seems to work really well on machine translation. The machine translation is nothing but sequence-to-sequence problems. So thereby, this approach has to work on many different sequence-to-sequence processing problems. And then the key thing is that in fact, every single problem that you can imagine can be framed as sequence-to-sequence problem. Whatever you write as a code, and then whatever the results that you get out is sequence-to-sequence processing. In fact, any kind of Turing machine can be thought of as sequence-to-sequence process model. So anyway, I was kind of back to where I was like, okay, so I'm not a computational linguist. Well, in hindsight, very fortunate. So then I started to actually do a lot of random walks. So if you have any questions or I did thoughts about all these different areas, I'm happy to actually talk about that. I have been actually working on medical imaging together with the radiology department at the NYU Langone for about now 10 years. I actually dabbled a bit on the machine learning for high energy physics together with Kyle Kempner and Jules Ruffin. I even worked on the AI for music, and then that's the only place where I ever got the best paper award at any kind of conferences. Is that I have a best paper award from the Izmir, which is the International Symposium on Music Information Retrieval, with Kyunghyun there. Then I wrote a couple of the papers on the how to use a word embeddings for analyzing the politics or the political text, information retrieval, computational protein modeling, and on and on and on. None of these actually panned out that much except for the medical imaging and the computational protein design, but I was kind of exploring a lot here to figure out, who I am and then what we are supposed to do. And then I think that what I am now realizing, we should have realized it like 20 years ago, but now is that I think that we are actually in a discipline of problem solving at the end of the day. And then it doesn't really matter what those problems are. What we do is that if we look at all those challenging problems, we look at the impossibly difficult problems that the humanity hasn't actually figured out how to solve. And then by looking at a lot of them, we can actually find some of the common substructure behind these problems. And then once we find it, we abstract out all the details. Then this is a part that I believe is really important, is that we abstract out most of the other details other than these core common substructures. And then we come up with a systematic and generalizable solution to address this substructure. Then what is really nice is that because the solution is systematic and generalizable, we will be able to solve not only the original set of the problems that we looked at, but also all the future problems that are going to share this common subproblem. So, for instance, let's try to think about the perspective of the natural language processing. So some of the problems that I looked at and then the whole community had looked at included machine translation, speech processing, both the synthesis as well as the understanding, dialogue modeling, and a few other problems. These all come under the umbrella of the natural language processing. Then what is the common substructure there is that at their core, all these problems are all about how to do scalable conditional density estimation over sequences or highly structured algorithms. And then we abstract out all the other details like the linguistics, grammars, or how the lexicons are created. I'm not going to abstract all of them out. And then just tackle this particular common substructure that is the scalable conditional density estimation over sequences. And we came up with a solution that is an autoregressive neural sequence model using attention as well as the recurrence or the various other, let's say, technologies that we have. And it turned out this solution is extremely generalizable. And then the same solution, say transformers, work for almost every problem that we have run into that we couldn't actually solve all the okay. Many problems, not every, okay. Many problems that we wanted to solve that we couldn't solve, including problems from biology, chemistry, physics, even political sciences, and nowadays even the economists are looking into it. And then once the economists start using your method, you know that this method is something that's going to be here forever because economists don't really change their mind that easily. So this is really getting this is what we did over the past, let's say, 15 years. So then I was like, okay, this is good. Now we need to just find the next set of the problems that we want to solve. And then I did just two criteria. I just want to discuss two criteria that I have used in order to choose some of these problems, and then try to connect it with what I worked on more recently. One is interesting. Is the problem, of course, has to be interesting. Otherwise, we won't be able to spend our efforts and invest a lot of, let's say, our own time to solve, find the problem, find the solution. The second one is that it has to be impactful. There are a lot of interesting problems, but most of those problems, even if you solve them perfectly, won't matter at all. That we want to always find if there are equally interesting problems, ones that if we solve them are going to have a huge impact on the society. So let's start with the impactfulness. One of the reasons why I knocked on the doors of the NYU Langone Hospital 12 years ago, or 11 years ago when maybe 11 years ago when I went to NYU, was because I wanted to work on something that was impactful, and the healthcare is something that is most impactful for the humanity. I don't know how much you think about the healthcare that much, but being in US, we tend to think about healthcare a bit too much, unfortunately. And in particular, if you're some students here, you're probably thinking about it a lot, and then being in Boston area also makes you think about healthcare a lot. The most interesting thing about the healthcare is the fact that we cannot opt out. No one can opt out of healthcare. In fact, in modern society, everyone is born inside health. So you are probably born next to some healthcare workers. Could be the doctors, could be nurses, or could be midwives. They're all healthcare workers. And then almost everyone dies within healthcare as well now. And then no one stays healthy forever and ever. Everyone gets sick, and then we need to go there, and that there's no way to opt out of healthcare. And then what that means is that any change we make touches upon everyone in the society. So impact is really high. But there's one unfortunate aspect of the healthcare is that it's super boring and super exhausting to work on health. Impossibly difficult, impossibly boring, and impossibly painful. But then if we narrow down within the healthcare to drug discovery, then we can actually add in a bit of an interestingness to this impact. And drug discovery is really interesting because the fact that we can design drugs is a true test of our ingenuity. So until about 80s, or actually right, yeah, until about 1982, every drug, so the medicine we had throughout the humanity's history has been something that nature has accidentally made and left somewhere that we found. A lot of people probably learned about the malaria, right? So what is the one thing that we know that has been effective for malaria? Gin and tonic. Tonic water. Yes, not DDT. Yeah. But DDT is very effective, but let's say as a medicine, tonic water, right? So the tonic water became very famous because of the tonic water actually has some of substances that were tiny bit, let's say, effective for the malaria. And then it's not like the nature found those molecules for us. But accidentally those things were left there. And then we find them and then started to use them as a medicine. But only in the 80s, we started to design our own drug. And then now we are in a cusp of can we actually use AI to design molecules that nature has not produced that can actually help us heal some of those symptoms or the diseases. We don't know how to do that well yet. We're doing it little by little, but this makes it really interesting. Now we're talking about using AI to solve problems that somehow nature has stumbled upon, but we have no idea how they did it and what they are doing. Why did they do it? So I thought, let's work on drug discovery or the molecular design. So during the past, let's say 5.5 or so, I've been working on this kind of protein design with the computational approaches. And in particular, during the past 4 years, I worked on the therapeutic antibody design at the team called the Prescient design. And then the goal was to let's build a whole system that includes not only the computational methods, but also the actual lab, so that we can make this kind of a virtuous loop of the design, test, and then feedback, design, test, feedback, on and on and on. I actually talked about it in my talk at iClear 2024. Do check it out. I actually go through all those computational challenges that exist within this system. Today, but I'm going to just talk about the challenge, how those challenges actually share some common substructure, and then what we can actually do about them in a system. So in this left-in-the-loop paradigm, this paradigm itself is like super straightforward. This is what we do every day ourselves in some sense. But let's say somebody told us that, okay, so we want to design a molecule that's going to be therapeutic and also will bind to or disrupt the process by working together with a particular target protein. That's going to be the starting. And then we're going to start with some initial candidate antibody. People talk about the de novo design. I don't think that's possible. Generally, we start somewhere, either the existing data or the antibodies that we get from the animal immunization campaign. Then we start from there. Then we're going to generate a bunch of the mutated versions of these antibodies using a generative models. So we do use all those, let's say, sequence models or the generative models in order to produce these mutations. And then we score each and every one of them using a set of computational property predictors. Then these predictors can be machine learning based or just physics based or something. But we're going to have a lot of them because there are many different properties that we need to take into account if you want to make sure that these molecules are therapeutic or that have the potential to be therapeutic down the road. And then using those scores, we're going to use a nice multi-objective optimization algorithm that's going to select a very small subset of these potential designs. Why it has to be a very small subset is because computational side, we can always increase the throughput. We're going to call up Jensen 1 and then ask for more GPUs, and then when we wire some money, we get more designs over indefinitely. However, on the lab side, that's not the case because we're now working with the real world. And then in particular, we're working with biology, and the biology has its own clock that we simply cannot speed up that much. So we have to select very carefully and automatically select a subset that's going to essentially cover the Pareto frontier as far as we know. And then send them to the lab. And then at the lab, we're going to synthesize and test them using the different assays, get all those signals, and then the signals come back, and then we're going to retrain everything and then go through it. So it's straightforward, right? There's a lab in the loop. There's a loop that is large computational, but there's a big portion that is a control lab that gives us the real signal. Although it is very straightforward loop that we have created, there are a number of challenges that we need to think of that turned out to be extremely difficult. The first challenge is what we call as a target discovery. I said that, somebody's going to tell us the target protein. But what is the target protein? Where does it come from? In fact, the target protein has to be something that we know are going to be inside this chain of a causal chain that leads to a group of the symptoms that characterize the disease. But how do we figure out that that is the target protein that we need to design? Of course, it turned out that we actually often don't know. And then a lot of the drugs are failed because those are amazing drugs that target something completely irrelevant. So it's very difficult there. Second one is the evolution. For instance, if you think about the antibody therapeutics, we're thinking about the amino acid sequences of the length anywhere between 400 to 1500 or even longer something. We're going to do the mutation, but of course, random mutation often fails. We need to know which ones are the parts that we want to actually mutate because we believe that that part has a big causal effect on the actual outcome. It's a very difficult problem, but this is a problem of the causal discovery as well as the And the third one is uncertainty. I don't know if you experienced it, and I'm pretty sure some of you have. The biology experiments, bench work, super difficult, and then also super noisy. Crazy how noisy it is. And then most of those noise is not unstructured noise, but it is in fact just a confounded noise based on some environmental factors that we don't know. What if it was raining a lot that day? Maybe some results are going to be different. There's a lot of let's say noise that happens. But then of course on top of that we are using machine learning algorithms a lot. And then we also use large amount of the data. So there's a lot of the sources of the uncertainty that we need to take into account in order to ensure that we make the best decision. The final challenge is this candidate selection. You go to the biology lab, and then our let's say antibody design and team, and then we tell them, oh, here are let's say bunch of sequences. It's human nature for them to ask us to rank them according to the scores. We're going to take the top 10 of them. And then obviously, as a computer scientist, we know that that's a very bad idea, right? That's called a greedy algorithm. We don't want that to happen. But we want to say that we need to do that. We need to make balance between exploration and exploitation. Now, how we do that is to mix in some of the random things here and there. But then, what is the best way to choose these few designs in that manner so as to maximize the success after several rounds of this black loop design paradigm? It's actually really difficult. It's often called the black box optimization or active learning or just online learning. So if I look at it a bit more carefully, there are actually three problems. They're really keys to make this left in the loop, let's say, design paradigm work really well. One is scalable causal discovery. And I'm actually adding scalable at every item here because yes, we can solve all these problems in an extremely low dimensional space with extremely inefficient manner. But so we need a scalable causal discovery, we need scalable causal inference, as well as a scalable black box optimization. And then of course, as we can see, and then if you just trust me, all three of these actually are built on top of a good, let's say, algorithms that allow us to actually quantify the uncertainty in a robust manner. But other than that, causal discovery, inference, and black box optimization seem like somewhat of a heterogeneous set of problems. So is there anything that is common between those three? That was the big question I've been asking. And about a year or so ago, I started to realize, and a lot of people realized it a long time ago, but I realized it, is that these problems are all challenging because we have to come up with a new algorithm. And in my opinion, we are just not good at coming up with new algorithms. If evolution has forgot to do something, is that the evolution has forgotten to given us an ability to come up with new algorithms readily for any problem that we want to solve. And that is the reason why the introduction to algorithm or the algorithm course at computer science undergrad major tends to be just 1 semester's long. Because the whole humanity has tried to come up with all those algorithms, and we can actually learn all of them in 1 semester. And if you think about it, half of them is about analyzing existing algorithms with the legal notations. So coming up with the algorithms is really difficult. In this room, there are a few people who know how to do that. I'm sitting there. Okay. Some people can do it, but once in a while. But it's really difficult for people in general to do it over and over. And then because there are so many problems that we want to solve, we actually want to make it more automated and systematic. And then this kind of problem, I think, is where we need to focus a lot on, because that's where the exciting portion of the artificial intelligence is. Where the human, so our level, our intelligence is the baseline, not the reference. We are the baseline. We just need to do it slightly better than us. So everyone knows about how we do it, especially in this crowd. Conventionally, what we do, we are given a problem. We think about it really, really hard, over and over. And then there's an aha moment. We're going to write down an algorithm, do some analysis, and then almost always realize that, this algorithm doesn't really work. We go back, think hard, and then try to revise this algorithm over and over. And then this requires a huge amount of agony as well as engineering. And then that doesn't scale to the number of problems we have that we want to solve. Even just for one problem of antibody optimization, we need like 3 or 4 different algorithms. we're not going to hope that somebody's going to ingeniously come up with this algorithm. So, and then these are like random. Let's think about the simplest possible example I could think of. Say I want to do a causal inference from mixed data. And then this is the simplest case you can imagine. And then we are now all expert in randomized controlled trials these days after the pandemic, right? So during the pandemic, we learned about the clinical trials, how they work and so on, which makes it so much easier for me to explain this. So T is going to be treatment. You can think of that as taking a COVID-19 vaccine or not. And then Y can be thought of, Y is an outcome. You can think of this as if you catch COVID-19, would you have a severe outcome or not, severe symptom or not? X is going to be essentially just who you are. And then the goal is to figure out what is the causal effect of taking this treatment on this outcome without being confounded by this X. There is a covariate there. Sometimes we observe them, sometimes we don't. Imagine that we observe them, that's fine. If you run the randomized control trial, we're going to get all those interventional data. We intervene on this treatment that's going to severe the connection going from the X to T. And then we don't have to worry too much about this compounding effect of X on both T and Y. And we can estimate this kind of simple causal effect relatively straightforward. It is extremely costly. It is extremely costly to run any kind of randomized control trial. And often we cannot even do that, especially if the treatment is high dimensional, and also if the outcome is high dimensional, because we will know when to stop as well. So clinical trial is de facto standard that we use, but this is too expensive, and this actually prevents us from coming up with more treatments and the therapeutic options for many of the diseases. Then, of course, we can say that, well, we're going to forget about the clinical trial. We're going to use the observational data. You go to electrical health records, we know everything about the patients. And then using that information, we're going to actually measure this causal effect. We can use a lot of different techniques, in particular, if you assume that there is no confounding factors or the unobserved confounding factors, and then we say that the positivity is not violated, that is that for each and every T, we'll have the coverage of each and every X that we're going to see in the future. Then we can use regression, inverse probability weighting, or the doubly robust estimator to estimate this. Unfortunate thing is that even though the data is abundant, these approaches are very sensitive to the model misspecification. And then that has to be always. There's no such thing as a perfect model unless we're working with the synthetic data. So then, of course, what we want is that we want to mix them to get the best of the both worlds. Really difficult to mix them up. We cannot simply pull them up. We need to use them very, very carefully to estimate the different quantities in a way that doesn't actually interfere with each other and resulting in a biased estimate of the treatment. And then I was like, okay, what are the typical things that people do? I looked it up while I was preparing this slide deck. There is no standard. It's all bespoke. Every situation is different. And every time you need to solve a new problem with the mixed data, you gotta actually take into account what kind of mixed data you have, what kind of problem you have, and then trying to come up with new ways to estimate. This is just a table I got from the Garcia, Udobro, and Oaks 2018. And then these are just a subset of them. There are so many different things. There is no standard way to do it. It's a bespoke way. And then this is a super important problem we want to solve, and we still don't know how to solve it because no one could come up with a scalable, systematic algorithm. And this really tells us that there are so many problems we want to solve, but we are now limited by our own inability to come up with a good algorithm ourselves. So then, of course, a better way that people have realized over time, over many decades, is that we need to just learn the algorithm. We need to make a learning algorithm that is able to come up with the algorithm to solve new problems. And it's really nothing but just saying that let's turn algorithm design into supervised learning problem. We will simply think hard about the problem in the way of generating synthetic data or the data generating processes. And then once we have a reasonable simulator or the way to generate a lot of diverse set of the synthetic data, we're going to just feed it into the neural network to solve the problem. Very straightforward. Nothing crazy here. So in the case of let's say, causal inference, what are we going to do? This neural net is going to take as input the combination of the interventional and observational data, and then it's going to give me one number that's going to be a treatment effect of my routine. And as long as we train this one, once the training is done, this neural net itself is the estimator. This is the algorithm that solves this problem. So in other words, we're going to think about the problem from the perspective of the forward simulation. And then we're going to punt the problem of coming up with the algorithm to our machine learning algorithm. There is a learning side. I didn't know what is the right way to call it, so that's why I call it learning to my students and people that I talk to. So the goal, and then you have in particular in scientific discovery, which is really difficult. We actually don't know how to do that well. This kind of learning to X is going to be a good paradigm to follow. Because we need to solve a lot of problems, and then we don't know the problem algorithms to solve them. So instead of trying to come up with the bespoke algorithms every time, we ask the learning algorithm to find the algorithm for us for the problems that we want to solve. Absolutely not the first time it was said. Everyone has been thinking about it. If anyone had any moment of, let's say, free time to think about AI in general. So it has been actually invented, reinvented, and reproposed and reproposed over the past, let's say, 3 decades or so. The one line of the work is often called the learning to learn or meta learning. If you go back to 1992, Sami Benjo and Yoshua Benjo, the brothers, wrote a paper on how to come up with a better learning algorithm for training this kind of neural network. And then in the same year, Jürgen Schulzberg wrote this kind of thesis that talks about the various other things, but including this learning to learn. And then this idea was revived in 2016, 17 under the various names of the learning to optimize, model agnostic meta learning, hyper networks, prototype networks, and so on. This line of the work is being pursued nowadays. Second line is the amortized inference. So instead of trying to figure out the whole process of defining the likelihood prior and then trying to solve the problem of the posterior inference and then using that to marginalize the data variable and then get to a predictive distribution, or if we train the whole thing all together on 80% of the data, that's often referred to as a neural processes, or even earlier, neural statisticians were proposed by the folks in the Edinburgh. And more recently, this is often referred to as a simulation-based inference or the simulation-based amortized inference. And some of the work on the causal discovery. And more recently, like the one thing that has been picking up was the prior period networks or the PF. These all follow the similar line of the work. And then beyond that, of course, there are work on the inferring the dynamics of the dynamical system without having to specify precisely the underlying dynamics. And finally, the most important thing, in my opinion, for today's talk is income. Oh yeah, so if you follow that QR code, I put all those references so you can just take a look at it here. So then, of course, if it's been the idea that has been pursued over 3 decades now, so why do we actually care about it now? Beyond the fact that I'm actually really interested in solving this scientific discovery problem myself, is because we now finally have the scalable network architectures that allow us to build a black box machinery that take as input the huge amount of the data as just a single instance, and are still trainable. And the second one is that it's all about the massive scale. Scale is important because as we go up in this ladder of the abstraction, we get increasingly more problems that come with the increasingly larger data set, and we want to handle all of them. And now we know how to do that. We are actually keep getting there. In 2000, let's say 10, we couldn't train anything that resembles what we have now. Whatever we were doing back then, combine all of them, and still they are all going to fit in one GPU, and then we'll be able to train all of them in about a week or so. Now we are in a really different time where the meta training is a viable and practical. And when we read the Brownell 2020, a lot of people thought that, oh, this is really cool, large scale model, does in-context learning. But what was cool was not that it does in-context learning, because that's not from this neural network, but that's from the data. But the fact that they were able to put in multiple examples in the single instance and then let it actually make a prediction. And in fact, last year, a year and a half ago, the Google DeepMind team in Montreal wrote a paper that said that in-context learning few shot, no, not anymore few shot, because we're increasing the context size extremely rapidly. they were using Gemini 1.5 Pro, which if you tried was really a horrible model. But still, they were this Gemini 1.5 Pro already had the context length of the 250,000 token or so. Nowadays, Gemini models have, let's say, 2 million or so of the context. They could put in the entire data set that consists of the more than 2,000 instances. The input-output pairs, 2,000 pairs, and then made a model just to make the prediction on the new instance. And then this is where everything changes, is that we're not talking about building one neural net for each of the data set. We're now treating one data set as a one instance in order to train a neural net to solve many different problems, or learning to solve all those different problems simultaneously. Now we can actually really use it in practice as well. So for the rest of the talk, I'll try to go through some of the ongoing studies from my lab at NYU. And then where we've seen kind of, or at least I've seen some glimpse of the wonders. I mean, these neural nets really are interesting. Before I go into there, is there any comments or the thoughts from the audience? Happy to hear about it. Yes.
Yeah, just a general question, like when you're putting together a company or a grant proposal for these directions, how do you estimate how many biological data points you need to show the model will become a product or whatever?
Yeah, so I haven't been so successful with the grants along this line, unfortunately. Yes, I will be able to talk about it a bit later, especially when I talk about the targeted cause discovery. So I have been very unsuccessful with this approach in grant proposal. But then, how many data points or the biological, let's say, experiments that we need to run in order to make these models work? I feel like that kind of question is what we need to often write in the NIH grant proposal, right? We need to talk about statistical power, we need to talk about the target, let's say, false positive rate, and then we need to do the reverse engineering to talk about the size of the studies. I think that's a completely wrong way or the opposite way to think about these problems. In fact, what I think we need to do is that we need to come up with the algorithm and then trying to figure out, given that algorithm, what is the maximum, let's say, number of data points or the minimum number of data points we need, and then just trying to empirically draw the plot of how the power changes, how our conclusion change. So in a sense that yes, our grant proposal, not been successful so far on this particular type, but I think the NIH grant proposals, the whole reviewing system needs to change, and then those panels needs to be refreshed at some point, especially this decision.
Yeah, so I think it's more like a perspective question, but like it's not obvious to me, like for say causal discovery, at least like in these healthcare examples and like looking at like public health, I kind of in the camp that like basically like regression is the gold standard, and the issue isn't like so much like a magical better algorithm. It's human has to figure out what are the plausible covariates we need to put in the model, and there's just a lot of hidden causes, and Y is correlated to X most of the time, and ultimately the answer is like we've got to do a trial. And in the science, I guess, like maybe there is something, but maybe the issue, like how do you think about the issue is like maybe it's not the algorithm, maybe it's more just you need someone very smart, in which case you want to lean off of the LLMs broad scientific knowledge to figure things out, as opposed to like coming up with a clever algorithm. They're more like designing the right experiment or the covariates.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point in a sense. So there are two aspects to what you just brought up. One is that what is the right way to approach this whole problem of the causal inference to start with, right? Is it really that it's so difficult that we have to run the randomized controlled trial over and over because that's the only way, or is it that we just decide on what is the right universe under which we're going to run the causal inference, and then we collect as much data as possible and then just run the regression there? I do agree that it's the latter that needs to be done, and that's the right way. Unfortunately, that actually requires us to make some decisions about what are the variables that we decided to include, what are the variables that we decide to ignore, what are the variables that we want to aggregate, and so on. And then where is the signal for that decision come from? In my view, it's a utility. So in the case of the public health thing, of course, will it actually help on average the whole, let's say, health span of the individuals or not? But I think that that's a kind of something that is out of the scope, but happy to talk more about it later. And then the second part is that when it comes to scientific discovery and whatnot, what is the thing that we need? Yes, I do believe that the LLMs can actually give us a lot of ways to figure out what kind of protocols we need to run, what kind of the same measurements we need to make. But eventually, all those things will have to be combined for us to draw a conclusion. And then that part, I think, is where this kind of learning tracks or the learning algorithm can come in and then help us as well. Yes.
I have a potentially two-part question. Ask the first bit. I guess you spoke about how you started with trying to come up with a way to abstract problems to get a more general form. I guess for these models, when they're learning to make algorithms, do you find that they, I guess, come up with similar solutions to problems belonging to the same family?
I'll talk about the
Okay.
Okay, what's the second one?
The second question was, I guess, how you felt about that, like the answer. But
Oh, how I felt about it. I mean, very
like,
sad,
if
very
the
sad.
answer was yes, I guess it was more like, would you have seen that as a success if they came up with like similar?
Yes. I mean, it's difficult to tell what these algorithms are, but let's look at some of them as a study. So just to tell you what causal discovery is, it's really maybe we can start by why do we want to do a causal discovery or the any kind of why do we care about the causality? Just to avoid making stupid mistakes. I see that a lot of people, all the people have their umbrellas open and it was raining. I'm not going to make a mistake by saying that well, we're going through the years of the drought in California. Let's send all those umbrellas to people there and then make them open the umbrella. That's going to be a stupid mistake. So yeah, this kind of causality is really important when we try to make some kind of action. We don't want to make a stupid mistake. We have to think somewhat about causality, despite the fact that we don't really require the precise physical notion of the causality. And then the causal discovery in this particular sense is just thinking about among all those variables in this universe, if I'm interested in one particular outcome variable, what are the other variables that are going to cause this outcome to go up or down? So that's the causal discovery. But then the one thing I want to talk about is that usually the goal of causal discovery is not about figuring out the precise causal mechanism by which outcome actually happens or the outcome values change. Because we often don't need to know or don't care to know about the entire causal mechanism. Because what we care about is the actionable cause. What are the things that we can act on or intervene in order to change the outcome so as to maximize our utility? A typical example is what are the causes of lung cancer or whether smoking causes lung cancer or not. We all feel like, oh yes, smoking causes lung cancer. I certainly believe so. But if you think about what are the steps that exist between initiation of cigarette smoking or the nicotine addiction all the way to cancer, there is an entire book from the US Surgeon General talking about all those different mechanisms. And there are like several thousands of the steps in between. And every single step has to work precisely in order for the cigarette smoking to cause cancer. However, for the purpose of the public policy and whatnot, we decided to abstract out all those intermediate steps. Then we also decided to choose cigarette smoking as one of the variables that we want to check whether this one causes a cancer or not. And then we made a lot of decisions there, right? So for instance, the question I have is that why did we choose a cigarette smoking as a variable? Shouldn't that have been a tobacco farmers? Because if the tobacco farms don't exist, there's no tobacco leaves. And as far as I can tell, tobacco leaves have a very low utility other than making cigarettes that are going to be smoked. Maybe that would have been a better variable, but we decided to go for this one. And then so we decided to study this kind of targeted cause discovery. So the goal, a goal could be that given a one target Y, or that you can think of this as a specific disease or the specific gene, whose expression I want to control, what are the other genes out of the 20,000 of them that are potential causes of this particular outcome gene? Then among them, I might find that some are easier for me to intervene on or design the drugs for, and then I'll be able to actually intervene on the outcome gene as well. And then now let's think about the very naive but pretty reasonable approach. What would be such thing? Is that I want to recover the graph. The graph that directed acyclic graph of all those variables in the system. And then once that is recovered, I'm going to pick my outcome variable and then just do the graph traversal to find all those ancestral nodes and then say that they are the potential cause. This is definitely a reasonable way to go about it. It's very difficult to approach it, implement it because it's not really scalable, both computationally and statistically. You gotta run a lot of independence testing, pairwise, or even pairwise or beyond. And then it's really difficult to come up with a scalable, effective algorithm that works on this kind of tens, if not hundreds of 1,000 variable cases. So what we do with this kind of learning to X paradigm is that we are going to define a meta distribution over the structural causal model, sample the structural causal model, and sample a bunch of observations from that. Some can be interventional as well. And then given the data, we're going to train a neural net that's going to predict or that learns to enumerate all the cause variables given the target variable. And then it's really nothing but sequence to sequence learning in some sense, right? And then we know how to do this at an extreme scale nowadays. So we're going to train this neural network. And then in practice, what this neural net does is to output a binary vector indicating which of the nodes are causes of Y, that is the outcome variable for each and every variable. We can just train it as a binary classifier. Now, of course, we have to think about the how to build these things, and then the reason why we can do it now is because it's actually all thanks to attention mechanism. We're going to use a neural net that's going to use the attention mechanism across the number of instances as well as across the dimensions as well. And then depending on how we build the attention mechanism and then where we add the positional embedding, along the instances, we're going to make a permutation invariant. So the output is not going to change at all. Across the dimensions, we want it to be permutation covariant here. I think that we want, depending on what we want to predict there. And then, yes, that should be a covariant. And then we just stack them on top of each other over and over. And then eventually we're going to have an NLP that predicts the binary, let's say, label for each and every variable. This is a network architecture we got from the LOCL 2022 from ETH. And we can use the various subsampling techniques to improve scalability. So, of course, the question is, where do we get the simulator for generating this? In the case of the gene regulatory network inference, which is one particular example that we use, we're going to use the existing gene expression simulator that is not perfect. If it was perfect, we wouldn't have actually need to solve this problem at all, but that is quite noisy here. But then we know that it is noisy enough so to the point that within the support of the simulators as an outcome, or at least the interpolation of some of the outcome, it's likely that the real kind of, let's say, gene expression data, gene expression lies. So that's kind of, let's say, a rough idea we have. And then once we do that, then we use this with the randomly generated gene regulatory networks or the directed acyclic graph. We will sample from some of the random graph distributions, such as the Ordo Shreni and scale-free and the stochastic block models, with 1,000 variables only during the training time, generate them, and then we train this neural network to predict, enumerate all these causes, and then we test it on the real biologically confirmed gene regulatory networks of the E. coli as well as the yeast. And they have more than 1,000 genes. And then what we see is that yes, of course, this one works better than the existing algorithms. I'm not going to talk about it in particular compared to many of this correlation alone baselines. It works significantly better. But what I want to bring your attention to is this right-hand plot. So if my algorithm recovers the full graph and then does graph traversal, what is the one footprint that we are going to find, or fingerprint? I don't know. The fingerprint we are going to find is that the error rate goes up as the distance between the outcome and the potential causes increases. Because you make one mistake in missing out one of the edges, then that's gone. And then that's true if you look at these two algorithms, Genie3 and Avicii, both of them just recovers the full graph. And after that, we just do the traverse ourselves. The error rate does increases monotonically as the cause-effect distance increases. On the other hand, this approach, this learning to X-based approach, has a generally lower error rate just because we trained it really well and so on, but it actually has almost like the flat error rate with respect to the cause effect distance. And then this actually tells us that it is finding an algorithm that is somewhat different from what I would have done. Okay, I would have actually just built a whole graph and then followed it. And it's probably doing something that is closer to the pairwise independence testing, but in a very efficient way because the number of samples we give is about only 100 each. So it's definitely not going to be enough to do all those the statistically meaningful, let's say, independence testing over and over. And then this is one example of how we can tell what kind of algorithms it learns, or at least what kind of algorithms it's not learning. That is, if we have this kind of fingerprint, we can actually check the fingerprint in order to tell what it does. And then we could just apply to the human gene expression data as well using 20,000 genes, so that's 20 times more. And then of course, when it comes to human data or the mammalian data, it's really difficult because we don't have the ground truth. And then to be frank, this kind of static gene regulatory network is kind of it's almost like a dream that we have that actually doesn't exist in the reality. So it's a very dynamic system. But what we see is that it does recover many of the previously reported in the literature, the cause genes of the many different genes, in this case, the oncogene called the MYCS. So what is the takeaway is that indeed, we often want to solve the problem as well as we can, and then plug in the neural network as some kind of stopgap measure for the sum of the gaps that we cannot kind of narrow down ourselves. But what we see here is that in fact, what we probably want to do is not to fill in the gaps as much as I can and then leave the neural net to fill the remaining gaps, but we probably should just go end to end from the beginning to the end. And then it turned out that this approach can actually solve this targeted cause discovery problem very well, at least way better than I could solve it myself. Of course, once you start to think about the causal discovery, and then if you see that, oh, hey, come on, so somehow causal discovery can be tackled pretty well, maybe we should do the causal inference. Now, in the case of the causal inference, I'm going to define it such that I know the actual, let's say, structural causal model, at least in terms of the relationship between variables, but I don't know the actual underlying mechanism that is a conditional distribution. And then the goal is that looking at all those data that has been collected, some are going to be interventional, some are not going to be interventional. I want to estimate the some effect, some causal effect of the treatments on the outcome. And there are different types of the causal effect, right? Average treatment effect, conditional average treatment effect, on and on and on. And it's really difficult to come up with a causal inference algorithm depending on what kind of treatment effect we're estimating. So we're like, well, we'll do exactly the same. We call it black box causal inference. So we sample from this meta distribution, and then a bit difficult part here is that we don't know exactly what is a causal effect, even when we know the structural causal model. Because unless it's all linear and so on, it's really difficult to compute. We're going to do the Monte Carlo approximation to estimate the ground truth causal effect, or the stochastic estimate of that. And then that's going to be the target. We train set transformer plus plus, by the way, I highly recommend it. Always work with the set transformer plus plus to simply take as input this set of samples and predict this single scale. And I'm not going to go into the detail of the algorithm because it's so straightforward. And I can tell you that if you minimize the mean square error, what does it do? It's going to minimize both the bias and the variance. And then that's exactly what we want. To find any kind of inference algorithm or the estimator, what do we want? We want them to have as small bias as possible and then low variance. And then training procedure essentially corresponds to finding such an estimator. And then after training is done, we can see how well it works on various different classes of the problems. In a standard, very standard identifiable cases with a very well-known estimators, this black box causal inference algorithm simply works as well as or better than many of the standard algorithms, in particular when the number of samples is low. When the number of samples is low, because we train this algorithm with the particular finite number of samples in our mind, we can find the optimal estimator for that particular setup, and it works better than many of the standard algorithms that were often designed with a asymptotic guarantees on, asymptotic guarantees on. Or we can think about some of the cases where we know that the causal effects are identifiable. However, we actually don't know. There aren't many well-known estimators. Even then, black box causal inference, it actually doesn't care, right? What does it do? It looks at the set of the data points. It knows that the problem can be solved. It's going to the prediction. It finds some estimator that's going to make a prediction. And sorry about that. And then this is the kind of cases where we have a randomized control trial data and the observational data as well. We didn't have to think about it. We just concatenate them, feed it into a neural net. It finds an optimal solution based on that one within this estimator family, which sounds like that's a bad thing, but before we couldn't actually find the good estimator to start with anyway. So it's a kind of, let's say, nice property. And we can go into a much more nonlinear cases with the conditional average treatment effect with the nonlinear mixing functions and whatnot. It's very trivially doable here, right? We don't have to worry about which are the variables that are going to condition them and whatnot. We just train a neural network. And then during the training time, we're able to set aside some as a conditional, the variable on which we condition, and then just feed it as a separate thing. And this neural net just learns how to mix them up in order to make the best prediction. And we could try it on the real world data. There's kind of all this possible real world data, but when you think about it, really difficult to have a real world validation with this kind of causal inference. So it's a data set from the Lalonde 1986 that studied the effect of a job training program. And unfortunately, due to some of the randomness in public policy, we actually have for this particular program both the observational data set and randomized data set as well. So you can actually test how well your algorithm that works on the observational data against the actual randomized control trial. Then what we see is that using a black box causal inference, we always get closer to the actual randomized the outcome compared to linear regression, multi-layer perception, as well as just ignoring the covariate, in which case the sign actually flips. So this is a very typical case of the confounding Bing major issue. So what is the takeaway here is that the same thing as a causal discovery, this learning track solution of the black box causal inference really frees us from having to design a new estimator for each and every problem we run into. All we had to do was think about the problem carefully and think about the forward path, which is much more reasonable for us to think about. And then finding the estimator, we leave it to the learning algorithm. And then what we can now imagine is that together with the language models, right, LLMs, you can connect them together and then create this kind of universal causal inference engine, where the problem setup as well as the treatment effect that you want to infer is described in language, and then turn it into this kind of hidden representation of the large-scale language model and goes into this BBCI model together with the data. Will we be able to train this kind of universal causal inference engine? That's going to be a big question for the future. Interestingly, this is, of course, again, we're not the first ones to do it. In parallel, two groups. One group is using one group from which the prior fitted network was invented earlier on, and then the other group from the University of Toronto, they also use a PFN to solve this exact problem, and then they often call it do PFN or the causal. So do I have enough? Okay, I'm going to just talk a bit faster. This one is just for fun. This is a very fun thing. Does everyone know mutual information? I presume so. Everyone learns about the mutual information. Weird thing is that no one actually uses mutual information itself, but it's a fascinating quantity. This is probably the most important quantity conceptually saying. It's just talking about the nonlinear statistical dependence between two random variables. And a lot of the algorithms that we come up with in machine learning ends up doing something to do with maximizing or minimizing mutual information, although we don't really maximize or minimize mutual information itself. Despite this importance, it's notoriously difficult to estimate. And then we don't know how to estimate in a high dimensional space in particular, unless it's all just normal distribution. And then the reason why it's difficult is kind of because how it's defined is that we need to know the densities. If we have only samples, we feel like because the mutual information is defined using densities, drawing densities and the marginal densities, we feel obligated to estimate those densities first, and then use those densities to estimate the mutual information. Or, we can of course go directly to density ratio estimation by training a classifier. But still, again, we're doing the same thing, just implicitly. We want to estimate density because mutual information is defined using density. But this is definitely a case where we're solving a more difficult problem to solve a less difficult problem. Because mutual information is a single scalar we need to get, but density is a very complicated thing to get. So we thought, okay, well, if this learning to X works, maybe we should just do this. We're going to train a neural net that's going to just give us a mutual information directly from a set of observations. And one nice thing is that 2 years ago, oh, I forgot to cite. Okay, so 2 years ago, a team from, again, Zurich came up with this nice idea that we want to benchmark all those mutual information estimators. How will we actually create all those different, let's say, diverse set of the examples by which they can benchmark the mutual information estimators? They start from just a normal distribution where I know the actual mutual information. Generate a bunch of samples and then feed those samples through this very complicated invertible nonlinear transformation. And then you do that for each of the variables separately, but because these are non-invertible transformations, nothing really changes in terms of the mutual information or the statistical dependence. Thereby, the mutual information is preserved. And they use that data set to evaluate all those mutual information estimators. And then we thought we'll just flip it. We'll just train a model. It takes us into the set, predict the mutual information as a regression plot. And then we train this model. And then it just works for almost any kind of data we throw at it. What you're seeing is a mean square error loss. And then the blue one is the in-meta distribution. This orange one is the out-of-meta distribution, however we define it. So ones that we didn't really use, all those flows. And then whatever the other, let's say, estimators you see, this algorithm is always giving you the better one. An interesting thing is by using this kind of learning track solution that is just a regression model, we actually get a free uncertainty estimate. Well, actually, just a one. So then, it works really well. That's what you see here. Is that if it's along the diagonal, it works that's better. Off diagonal, not good. KSG is the one that actually works reasonably well even on a high dimensional space. It uses the nearest neighbor structure to estimate the mutual information. Predictive, and then what you see on the diagonal line is the proposed approach. It just gets the mutual information almost perfectly in an extremely wide range of the true mutual information value. And furthermore, we get a free uncertainty estimation as well. So what do I mean by that? Is that there is an error in estimating mutual information due to the fact that we're using a finite number of samples. Now, in other words, given this data set, there is a noise in our mutual information target. And then what we can do is that we just use a technique called the simultaneous quantile regression. And then we train this model, and then this model is going to give us any kind of quantile value. 0th quantile all the way to the 100th quantile. And when we look at the calibration, how well it's calibrated, here's a target quantile. We're looking at a marginal only, and the empirical coverage. This blue dot corresponds to the quantile regression version. Then it's almost perfectly calibrated. And all we had to do was just change the loss function to what we call as a pinball loss. And that's it. Trained exactly the same way. It gets us the uncertainty as well. Now, when we go further away from the original training set, yes, it gets a bit less calibrated, but compared to whatever else we can do, such as a bootstrap resampling, we always get a much better calibrated version. And then what it really tells us is that there are a lot of the problems that we didn't know how to solve. In the case of mutual information, the best way is that you solve the optimization problem by maximizing the classification accuracy. And then when it hits the maximum, you look at the log loss, and then that's going minus the log loss. That becomes pretty much the best thing you can do. But it turned out that we can actually skip the whole process. We just let it predict it automatically. And then it works better than most of the existing estimators that are state-of-the-art and whatnot. And that there's no, let's say, problem with the computational equation. And we get a free uncertainty quantification as well, which is almost never the case with any kind of a variable. So because of the time, I might have to skip this one, although this is my favorite. I must just tell you one quick thing is that just like the SGD plus momentum is better than SGE, in the case of this kind of Bayesian optimization as well, if we use the trajectory information, we can actually do better in turn out. And then how to take into the trajectory into deciding the acquisition function has been a big question. It's unclear how to do it. We rely on this kind of, oh, hope that our model is going to adapt well so that that's going to be fine. But it turned out that what we can do is we can actually train a transformer network, transformer that's going to look at the previous selections and then try to choose the best one, the best next one, on a bunch of the simulated, often created by the deep Q learning based policy to trajectories before. And then we test it, and then it actually works much better than the trajectory unaware model, that was the trajectory aware models. But only when we train a model with the model agnostic meta learning objective function rather than the maximum likelihood. Then this actually tells us about some quirk of this kind of generalization in this kind of meta learning, but I'll have to skip for now. I don't really have a good answer there. Anyway. So just before wrapping up, a couple of the open questions. One is that although I said that there's a free calibration of the uncertainty, that's only true at the about the uncertainty at the level 1. That is for that particular problem that we are solving. However, because we are doing a meta training, there is an extra layer of the uncertainty that is introduced because of the use of the learning and the data that we use during the meta training and from the meta distribution level. What is the right way to kind of think of and then calibrate these extra sources of uncertainty is going to be an interesting question. And then second question is, of course, the extra dimension of generalization. We're not talking about the instance level generalization anymore. We're talking about the task level, problem level generalization. And in doing so, it turned out that this simply using a neural net, state-of-the-art neural net with the maximum likelihood estimation using a stochastic gradient descent wasn't the optimal thing necessarily, because from the last study that I didn't have the time to talk to you about, and then this actually tells us about if you're doing this kind of meta training, is there a more or better objective function that we can use rather than the usual maximum likelihood objective? And the final thing is that how do we trust it? This is the questions that we get from the reviewers as well as our friends and everyone, is that the classical algorithms, we know how it's written down, and then we often can prove, or some people prove the asymptotic guarantees about these algorithms. Great. But these learned algorithms, they are black boxes, and then we don't know what's going on there. And then there's a minimum guarantees there. Now we can talk about the uncertainty quantification a bit, but as we saw earlier, when we were thinking about the problems that are very, very different from the ones that we're using during meta training, the uncertainty is not well calibrated either. So how do we think about this? And my thinking is that we need to now move on from the guaranteeing a priori to verifying a posteriori. So we're going to look at the algorithm and then trying to see how well it works instead. And then we can do that in a very empirical manner. This is one example we have, is that the estimating population standard deviation turned out to be impossibly difficult. It's a completely useless quantity, but still population level standard deviation is difficult because the sample standard deviation is a biased estimate of it because of the square root. We train a neural net, and then what we see is that it does it better. But then what we see, and then we can check that whether it's kind of relatively consistent or not by just testing it beyond the training, let's say, sequence length, and then further, and then trying to see if it actually converges for a certain value. In this case, that happened. The one was for the normalities. Again, that happened. But we can see that we can come up with all those tests to verify that it works. And then in doing so, I think the most important thing that I wanted to say, but already Rich Sutton said in 2020, is that we need to just embrace the fact that we have to work with the approximation. In order to solve a really difficult problem, we have to embrace the approximation. And then a posteriori, we're going to try to provide some kind of, let's say, empirical guarantee. So that actually concludes my talk by saying that the reason why we're doing it is that we want to capture this impossibly difficult thing that the very small number of people do once in a while. That is that discovering something profoundly novel about the universe. That is a scientific discovery. We don't know how people do this. People have this kind of aha moment and then they figure it out. Einstein is a bit of a old news, but still, he was just thinking a lot and somehow figured out the relativity. how? That's the process that we want to eventually capture. Now, I don't think we'll be able to write it down. We'll probably have to learn that kind of process. And then that concludes my talk. Thank you.
Thank you for the very interesting talk. I have a question about the generation part, that they were now asking the language model to generate it in algorithms. How do we guarantee that that vertical integration?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. I don't know where I should go all the way to, but I'll just say it's so you're absolutely correct. This is not only about this one, but nowadays when we look at all those, let's say, benchmarks or the results or amazing accuracy that we see, almost everything is about precision. Are these language models answering the question that we know how to answer in the way that makes sense? Or at least the way that we can verify very rapidly, and then they all go for the precision. On the other hand, when we are thinking about using these algorithms for something that covers a profoundly, let's say, novel things, we're actually talking about the recall rate. And the recall is something that's really difficult to measure in general, because if you could measure it, we often tend to solve the problem ourselves. So how to ensure that the recall rate goes up is a very active area of research in LLM as well as generally so. And I don't think there is any one easy way to say that, well, we have increased the recall, unless we can actually connect it with the real world kind of validation loop, and then check whether some of the things that we have found are real and are to come from the existing. It's Friday afternoon, and then why do they? Okay.
How do you, they're describing the algorithm, but, there is a sense in which, we may not actually have the right data to do discoveries. So, so in terms of like how you think about the design of experiments, talking about that a bit.
Yeah. That one I'm going to go all the way a bit. That's actually one of the most difficult thing and then very timely thing. So the question is that yes, I have actually talked a lot about how to come up with the algorithms. But then of course algorithms can take a very many different roles. Yeah, so in fact, one of the actual bottleneck in this kind of scientific discovery is not about hypothesis generation. So a lot of the startups actually come talk to me and say, no, we have an amazing hypothesis generation machine, and we are raising around $100 million. And I was like, I tell them, the first thing you need to do is to raise $100 million, give up on the hypothesis generation, build a lab, quickly build a lab. So this part is actually one part that a lot of people, including Genentech, are focusing a lot on. How to build a automated lab that is rapidly reconfigurable using some kind of, let's say, description coming out of the LLM or whatnot. And then once that happens, in fact, the whole loop can have another loop inside it. And then that's more of a, it turned out that the left side is difficult, but the left side can be reconfigured, and then discovery in the lab procedure can happen in the exactly same way as I. But it turned out that that part is slightly more difficult because many of the devices are legacy devices that require you to essentially bring your USB drive, thumb drive, and then connect it up and then. But people are actually working on that one. Once that's done, then we can actually talk about the actual loop in the loop to automate the whole process, including the experimentation as well. This part is much more challenging to automate or reconfigure on.